ready for our next panel. It is a media panel, and it will look at how can the media drive change for more diversity and representation, reflecting changing social attitudes. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Prideaux from The Economist, please.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm not sure how to follow that performance. I do actually have a guitar with me in the hotel, but I didn't bring it, which is probably a relief to all of you, because I can only play about 5 chords. We've got a great panel this morning. Yesterday's was good. I think this is going to be better. We've got some amazing panelists. I'm going to bring them out one by one and introduce them, and then we're just going to get going, and we'll make sure we have time at the end for questions for you. So first of all, I'd like you to welcome Neha Dixit. Neha, come on up, is a brave, independent, investigative journalist in India whose work has landed her in trouble with her government at home. So the best kind of journalist. Carolina Guerrero founded an amazing radio station, long-form podcast called Radio Ambulante, which she'll tell you all about in a minute. It's fascinating. And last but not least, we have Karen Okongo, who's a sort of media entrepreneur. Karen founded an amazing picture agency called Tonal, which she'll explain to you all about once we get going. Between us, we've racked up a lot of air miles. Neha's come in from Delhi to be here. Carolina's come in from New York. And Karen wins because she's come from the West Coast, from Seattle. So thank you all so much. Carolina, I want to start with you. Explain to the audience what Radio Ambulante is, how you started it, why you started it.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me here and having us talking about this very important issue, diversity. I'm not sure if anyone on the audience is familiar with Radio Ambulante. Has anyone heard? It's okay, great. Radio Ambulante is a Spanish language podcast telling uniquely Latin American stories. So when we say Latin American, we are including stories about Latinos, because we consider that the US is a Latin American country because there are more than 50 million people who speak Spanish there. We wanted to change the narrative about what we heard about ourselves in the media and created this podcast, took advantage of the technology that was available for creators, independent creators like us.
Because when you started, podcasts were not a big thing, right? You were fairly early in this.
Yeah, it was basically, that was the time when public media shows were transitioning just into digital, 7 years in 2012. But we found that spot and saw the possibility to create something that was representing these voices in Spanish and took advantage of the big population in that was among like the continent. So Radio Ambulante is a regional program. It's not, we're based in New York, but all our correspondents are among the region.
And give the audience a sense of the kind of stories you do, because the way you've described it is great, but I think they'll get a real feel for it if you...
Yes, sure. What we do is long-form audio journalism. And it's a character-driven content. If anyone is familiar with like public media shows in the United States, like This American Life or Radio Lab, this is the kind of content that we do. We have partnered with them, in fact. And basically, it's a story told in the voice of the characters, but told as if it were literature. It's like it has a plot. So the person, we wanted these voices from Mexico or Colombia or Argentina or Puerto Rico telling the stories themselves, the real story. We didn't want to have this like a reporter going and documenting just breaking news. So it's long form and it's very engaging, and we feel that it creates a lot of empathy.
Tell us about your Cuba episode.
Okay, yeah. So what we try to do is challenge the idea that everybody has about Latin American, even Latin Americans, right? Because we're a very diverse country, but we need to continent, but we need to learn also about our other countries. No, it's like we have this common language, but we really don't know much about ourselves, neither. So what we like that episode is called. We have 2 episodes actually. One is called Los Frikis, the Frikis, and the other one is Los Sobrevivientes, the survivors. And it tells, it reflects, is a good example of the kind of stories that we find. So in the 80s, there were rock musicians in Cuba who were into rock and punk, and that was forbidden in Cuba because it reflected like too much of America or the United States. So they were kind of like a cult, and at some point, some of them got infected with AIDS because that was the terrible age of the decade of AIDS, and they were sent to this kind of like retreat house to be hidden from everyone. But at that house, there was a lot of like meat and freedom. So many other of them started self-infecting with AIDS to be sent there. And our story tells the story of two survivors, the two only survivors from that era. But also like about, it also tells about the culture of like what being a freaky meant at the time. So as you see, this is a good example of like trying to change the narrative about Cuba and Cubans. And this is what we try to do constantly, is try to challenge also ourselves and do a better job at finding stories that are not reported.
Karen, that changing the story is something you've thought about a lot, right? You're a media
Absolutely.
entrepreneur. You founded a new picture agency. Why did American journalism need a new picture agency when you came along?
When I came along, I actually had a background in starting a blog with some of my sorority sisters. And it was called The Sorority Secrets, and we really centered around telling the stories of women in sororities. You know, we captured beauty, fitness, health and wellness, cooking, fashion, all of that. And it became very clear to me when actually an African-American friend of mine came up to me, it became very clear that we were not actually diverse. He asked me, he said, how come you don't showcase more black people on your site? And as someone who is black, as someone who is first-generation Nigerian American, I was shocked. I said, no, we do. We have black people on there. Scrolled through my website, could not find a single person who was black. And it made me realize that we have been so accustomed to seeing the world as white that unconsciously I wasn't displaying media that looked like myself or other underrepresented people. And so a few years later, I ended up meeting my co-founder, Joshua Kissy, and just really asked him, you know, what he thought about what stock photography looked like right now and if he wanted to combat that with me. And so that's why we decided to start Tonal. And so Tonal is a diverse stock photography business aimed to showcase those who are underrepresented or misrepresented, but not only just to show them, but also to tell their stories, which is why, you know, Carolina, everything that you're doing is so in parallel with what we have embarked on, because those stories are very important. And like you said, those stories create empathy and just more understanding of different people.
And so how did it make you feel when you looked at the news, before your agency came along, when you looked at the news, picked up a newspaper, and you didn't see a lot of people who looked like you in it? How did that make you feel about the news you were consuming?
Well, me, I'm 30 years old, and I thought to myself, gosh, I haven't been around that long, but it's crazy to think that the media has looked like this for decades, for centuries. And nobody has really went full throttle to change that or shift that. So it made me think, do we not matter? And that's something that is a real thought for a lot of people who are underrepresented is, am I not being displayed because I'm inferior, you know, because I'm less than, because I don't matter? And so that's exactly what it invoked in me. It was, is there something wrong with people that look like me? That's the first thought.
And the existing picture agencies, the kind of incumbents who you were trying to disrupt, why were they only putting out, or not only, but largely putting out stock photos of white folks? I mean, presumably that wasn't a deliberate decision, right? It was just something that sort of unconsciously they'd found their way towards. How do you think about the kind of intentions behind?
I think that we all are a blank slate. And the things that happen around us, whether it's culturally, religiously, just our environment in general, shape the way that we see the world. And a lot of those people who started those stock photography businesses came from their own sort of bias, unconsciously. And what happens when you are using unconscious bias is you don't realize that you are actually moving in that direction and you're creating that constant circle. And you may not think it's bad because it's normal to you. So for them, the images that they were displaying were normal to them because that was a part of their cultural norm. So that is something that we definitely recognized was a problem and needed to be addressed, that implicit bias.
Neha, let's turn to you. You report about a society that is very divided by caste, not so much by race, but by caste and by religion.
Yeah.
Can you tell the audience a little bit about your work and some of the ways in which writing about those subjects has landed you in trouble?
Okay. First of all, I'm very happy to be here. And let me start with this, that increasingly in India, especially as a journalist, or especially with a lot of people in the media, what has happened is that, like globally, there is a lot of corporatization of media, and which is why in each mainstream news organization, you're told to focus at a target group while you're reporting. So which is why the story that you do, or for example, the last news organization that I was working for, and after that, I started working independently because that is the time when I knew this is not what I wanted to do in my life. So where we were told a new corporate group had acquired certain percentage of shares in this mainstream media organization. So which is why we were told that from now on, our target audience is the urban rich. So which means that we were categorically told, don't do these back of the beyond stories, don't do bleeding heart stories, which means only do stories on who are the rich kids racing fast cars in South Delhi. And as an investigative journalist, I was told, find out where are the drugs coming from in the Indian Premier League parties. And I was like, I don't have the skills to do such stories. And also the branding of the story, so which is why the headline and everything. So if this is the model that the mainstream media is following, there is not much scope to look at the diversity of the society that you're reporting for, and which is why the most socio-economically marginalized sections, like you mentioned, caste, and I don't know if people here are familiar with caste, which is we have a hierarchy in the Hindu religion based on caste. Caste is a hierarchy, and on the basis of that, for centuries, we've had people discriminated against, and things like untouchability and other stuff practiced against people. And one of the sections that is extremely marginalized because of the system are the Dalits. Similarly, we have been a secular country for the last 70 years since we've been independent, but at the same time, increasingly religious polarization in the Indian politics has led to marginalization of religious minorities like the Muslims and the Christians. So that is the challenge, and if this is the mandate of the mainstream media that you're reporting for, there is a lot of trouble when you try and report on such subjects in this kind of framework. So you mentioned the stories. There are two stories that I would like to talk about. In 2016, I had done a story for Outlook magazine, and it was published in August 2016. And the story was about how 31 tribal girls from Northeast India, the state called Assam, between the age group of 3 to 11, were trafficked by an organization called RSS. RSS is a Hindu fundamentalist nationalist organization in India. It is the parent body of BJP, which is the ruling party right now in India. And the ideology of RSS is to convert India and, in their imagination, the subcontinent as a Hindu place and adopt the Hindu way of life. So I found out that these girls between the age group of 3 to 11, all of them tribals, were trafficked by 3 RSS-affiliated organizations. And
so this is the RSS, an organization that has kind of close ties to the government in India.
Yes,
but
it is the parent body of the ruling party.
Exactly, isn't actually part of the government, but had effectively kidnapped some children in northeast India.
So basically, these are really remote tribal parts where the parents were told that we'll be taking away the girls for free education, we'll provide them free education and lodging. But once the girls were taken away, the parents just couldn't get in touch with these daughters. And these are those areas where the photographs and the identity cards of the girls were also taken away. And once you take them away from such remote areas, the parents have no way to even prove that they had these daughters. So I found that out, so I met the parents, and they said that they just can't get in touch with them. And then I found a trail of government documents where the government, the local child welfare committee, each Indian district has a child welfare committee, and the State Commission for Protection of Child Rights wrote officially that this is child trafficking, because there is a law and there is a Supreme Court judgment in India that you cannot take children away from the Northeast India, even for the purpose of education. And it is against the UN Convention on Child Rights. So they wrote that send the girls back, this is child trafficking, but they did not pay heed. So I managed to track down the girls, 20 of them in a state called Gujarat, 11 in Punjab. So I went to meet them.
How long did this take you? This sounds like a lot of detective work.
It took me 4 months to do the story. And I tracked the girls and I found them in Gujarat. The girls were there in another Hindu RSS-run organization where they were not given any formal education. But they had classes on Hindu ideology. And to cut the story short, the 7-year-old girl from Assam told me that how Hindus and Muslims are a threat. They are rapists and they're invaders. And so there's something called Johar in India, in the Hindu upper caste system, where the idea is that if a woman is feeling threatened and feels a threat and a rape threat or something of that sort, she should immolate herself. And this 7-year-old girl told me that her ideal is one queen who committed Johar and who immolated herself. And she said that to prevent her own honor and for the Hindu country that she wants, she is ready to immolate herself. So, and later on, when I was there, they locked me up, the people, and it took me a while to come back. But thankfully, when the story was published, it was read. And that's when they filed 2 cases against me, 2 criminal cases against me. One is this ancient law we still have in India, which is called criminal defamation. So it's not civil, but it's a criminal law. And the other is of inciting communal hatred. So after the story was published, as usual, and a lot of journalists are facing this in India right now. So there were rape threats, there were life threats, there was stone pelting at my house, and all of this happened. My family was threatened. But the good thing is that 2 years later, 24 out of those 31 girls have come back. So that is the thing, but still the cases are on. The other story that happened was, again, when we talk about diversity and marginalization, is that in the last 1 year, so there is a North Indian state called Uttar Pradesh. Its population is as huge as the population of Brazil. And it has a lot of political weight because it sends the maximum number of parliamentarians to the Indian parliament. So we have a Hindu radical monk now as the chief minister of that state. His name is Yogi Adityanath, and he's known for his Islamophobia. He's known for making very sexist, misogynist, and communal sectarian remarks. So since he became the chief minister of the state, there were 1,400 police encounters in the state. So in popular parlance in India, police shooting is called police encounters. And out of those 1,400 encounters, some 76 people lost their lives when police shot at them. And most of these people were either Dalits or Muslims. And the charges were as petty. So I found out the cases, I managed to track the families of these people who were killed. And the charges were as petty as stealing a gold ring, and these are not even proved in the court of law, or stealing a gold chain, or stealing a theft of 8,000 Indian rupees, which is like $100 US, something close to that. So, and also the fact that before being killed, they were beaten up, the eyes came out, the bones were broken, the skull was broken. So I managed to find those details. And the police said that, the police version was that they had stolen something and they were running away, and we tried to stop them, they shot back at us, and when they didn't stop, we shot at them and they died. But the number is now 76. The other important thing that happened was that there are close to 300, 400 people who, during these encounters, again, very young Muslim and Dalit men, have been shot in their legs. Once they were shot, they were taken to the prison, and no treatment was provided to them for the bullets. So they ended up having septicemia, and a lot of them have lost their legs, got amputated because of the septicemia. So after the story was published, again, the police Like, this is like a usual thing now. So the police called me up and told me that I know where your mother lives, I know where your family lives, and that kind of threat. Nothing has happened, but the only good thing that happened in January this year is that the UN finally took cognizance of the cases that I reported and wrote to the Indian government saying that there is clear evidence that these were not chance encounters, but they were carefully thought out by the police how to kill these people. The central government still hasn't responded, but let's see what happens. So.
That's very impressive work. I love how relaxed you are about. Yeah. I love how relaxed you are about being thrown into prison for a little bit for my work. But, you know, whatever. Like, it was a sort of slight, mild inconvenience. Carolina, some of the places you report don't, you know, intimidate journalists to the same extent, but are not super easy, right? I mean, Cuba's not the easiest place to do reporting. Have you had some difficulties of this type producing Radio Ambulante, or is it the case that because of the sorts of stories you do, which are more narrative and less kind of directly on politics, you've been able to kind of go around some of those problems a bit?
So we have, usually we have like some people on reporters in-house, and we work with contributors, and both, like all of them go and report the story on site. So we have covered, for example, violence in Mexico, or we have covered investigative stories, one recent about like the border in the US, or so we don't take, I mean, those risks, like probably our journalists are not yet like on a story like that, but we do a lot of investigative reporting. What we do is that we want to make sure that the journalists covering those stories who are working with us are like protected, which is always a challenge. But we have covered also journalists, the work of journalists. For example, we reported a story about the work of Anabel Hernandez, who's the journalist from Mexico who has investigated El Chapo Guzman, the narco who was just in jail from Mexico, and how she described basically like something like that, which is very, for us it's important that people know this story, so we report on them, but we are also like aware that we need to protect our journalists. And it's, when we started, many of the stories start like coming from capital cities, but our goal was to expand that, because usually we are very centered in Latin America, Bogota, Colombia, Caracas, Venezuela, and so on. So we try to just go to the countryside and report on other issues like climate change, resisting indigenous communities against like like mining or things like that.
So both of you report on the country and the region that you report on in ways that are quite different to how perhaps the New York Times might do it, or a kind of English-speaking Western media organization. Karen, can I turn to you? Why is diversity in journalism important? Why is it important to have people of different backgrounds in a newsroom rather than just a group of like-minded folks who all went to school and college together?
There are so many layers to why that's important, and I can take it from one angle and talk about the financial importance. So WGSN released a report. It's called the Future Consumer Report. It basically just talks about spending habits that are happening here as we continue to evolve as a nation, as an entire different countries. And right now, when you focus on buying power, by 2050, a quarter of the world will be what we call Generation M, which are Muslim millennials. And their spending power is going to be in the billions. And so when you think about groups like that who have, had some unfavorable perceptions, whether in the media or in certain households, you have to ask yourself, am I going to go against the grain, or am I going to ride the wave and be that change maker and address those particular people? Because there's a lot of buying power. And what happens is when you are not actually catering to these misrepresented or underrepresented groups, there's an amount of money that you're missing out on. And what's happening is you're seeing a lot of companies like Tonal rise above and take a part of that market share that has been underserved. And so I think that it's important for there to be a level of diversity, because there are also reports out there that are proving that it's actually benefiting organizations. And I know that we were talking backstage about how, you know, it's important to create that education. Why is diversity important is not just throwing out a women's affinity group. It's explaining how are you going to improve in sales, in camaraderie in the organization when you have more women in power. So those are just some of the reasons that are important to have diversity.
It also affects the story selection you make, I think. So I think about, I manage a team of journalists, so I think about this stuff quite a lot. And on the one hand, I have quite a lot of kind of white British folks working for me, because The Economist is based in London. It's a largely white society. And when those people go and report in America, they might be reporting in a, you know, quite a tough neighborhood like the south side of Chicago, where there's quite a lot of violence. And actually, with a funny British accent, they find that that can kind of open some doors, because people find it hard to place them. It's almost like they're from kind of Mars. It's like, well, what are you doing here? And so it can be helpful from that point of view. Where it's unhelpful, I think, is on the level of kind of story selection, when you're thinking, okay, what are the sorts of things that interest me? And those, through no fault of the journalist, you know, those interests are invariably a product of things you've read, things you've studied, your upbringing, you know, where you went to school, all those kind of things that go together to make up our interests as people are reflected in those story choices, and that's where I think you fall over if you don't have a mixed group of people, because you're just going to miss a lot of really interesting stuff.
Absolutely. We have to get more brave about getting out of our comfort zone. And going back to that unconscious bias, we have to understand that we all have unconscious biases. So it isn't just reserved for those who we think are, you know, the majority. We all have a level of bias, but what's important is for us to understand it and be slow about the way that we make our decisions. You know, it's important for us to integrate other opinions and make sure that we're not just telling the story from our one narrow point of view. We're actually taking the time to understand different people in our organization who are diverse and their perspective, because I think it will foster better change.
Can I add to that? So I think also, like, editorially, it's important to have someone representing the community that you're reporting on. It's not only like the kind of stories that we find, but also if you're reporting, it's very common that, like, you're reporting on I don't know, about an African American neighborhood, and you only have like when you deliver the story, nobody's there to watch, to take care of the language, or like knowing this, if this is like really talking to the community. Most articles in the US, and we have seen it a lot, I think it's changing now a bit, is like when you read the story, it's about Latinos, but Latinos are not telling the story.
Exactly.
And this is very important to have like a woman, no? Or like sometimes like it's men talking about women's issues, and like, okay, great, include a woman into that editorial conversation.
It's a difficult one though, because part of journalism, I think, is understanding something that's foreign and unfamiliar to you. You know, if you're good at it, you ought to be able to have enough empathy that you could write about, you know, something that is not of your culture. So, you know, you're incredibly smart. You could come and write about, you know, kind of white male British politicians, I think, because, you know, you're empathetic and you're smart. So there's an element of it which involves kind of hopping over those identity and kind of background barriers. But if you do it with a group that's all kind of looks and sounds the same, you're going to end up with less interesting journalism, I think.
I just wanted to add to what you're saying, because I was placed, last year I was doing some fellowship, and I was, as part of that fellowship, I was placed in an Indian mainstream newsroom, and I had to set up the gender beat. So it started with I was very proud of myself by the end of it, because I was almost doing this every day doing this under the desk, so that I don't respond to what people are saying to me. The first thing the CEO said, we don't need more gender reporting. We anyway put out motivational quotes for women. So I was like, great, that's a great start. And then they say, yeah, we do things around gender. We write on gender violence. We write about maternity health. And that is the only thing they understand, because they think as if gender reporting is all about people's reproductive organs and nothing else. It's not about pay gap. It's not about, it can't have an intersection with business, with sports, with defense. And the other thing that I, as a journalist, face a lot, and I was saying this backstage, that So all my stories, whether it's political, whether it's this kind of investigation, I do make sure that I also speak to women on the ground, because what often happens is if somebody gets killed, it's the father of that person, dead person, the brother of that dead person who appears in the story. So in my stories, I try, sometimes I may falter as also, but I try and speak to women also around. So each time I'm introduced, it's like, here is Neha and she writes on women's issues. And I'm like, you know, the entire last year I only did stories on police encounters, but that's my thing, that I write on women's issues. And in 2015, I had written this profile of this politician. He was the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh again, Akhilesh Yadav. And in that story, there was a bit about his family as well. So when the story came out, everybody was like, oh, woman writer, of course she'll write about the family. Like, women always write about family. But thankfully, I was vindicated because family was an integral part of his political party, and that led to the split of the political party, the family politics. So I was vindicated. But that is the kind of thing that people think, and which is why, at least in Indian media, we do not have women in decision-making positions. So we are there, the number is quite a lot. We are there in the middle rung, the lower rung. We do all the kind of reporting that needs to be done. But when it comes to making a decision, we are not there. Similarly applies to Dalits. There is a 2013 report by the Hoot, which is the media watchdog in India, which tells us that there are only 21 accredited Dalit journalists in the country. This is like absolutely, ridiculous. And
what's the population of India?
1.2 billion.
And how many Dalit journalists?
21 accredited, yeah. And similarly, for a lot of tribal journalists, what happens is that journalists, and I am also, let me acknowledge that I'm also an upper caste privileged person, but at the same time, each time somebody from the metros goes to the tribal areas in India to report, and this happens globally, we use the local journalists who are called stringers and fixers. So we don't give them an outlet to tell their own story, but we kind of paraphrase, go there, use their information and paraphrase it and write it. And that is why it's important to get more people to tell their stories directly instead of somebody from a position of privilege paraphrasing it. So that's a big problem here in India.
Karen, you brought up unconscious bias, and I'm just thinking, listening to both of you guys, in India you have a politician running the country, Narendra Modi, who's a genius at exploiting people's unconscious bias, in particular the unconscious bias of Hindus against Muslims and some other groups. And American politics, this is the kind of story of American politics at the moment. So can you give us some tips on how to keep that kind of unconscious bias in check? I think most of us would like to think, and probably make efforts not to be kind of prejudiced in a way that American society was prejudiced in the 1960s, say, before the Civil Rights Act. And yet, there's a kind of residue of that history that comes out unconsciously the whole time. And being aware of that is very important.
Absolutely. And unconscious bias, it happens. Sometimes we act on it in the worst times. It usually happens in fear. We start to go back to the things that we've seen, the things that we've heard, and we make that judgment. And so, what I would teach people to do is to be aware of your unconscious bias, but don't lead with it. Allow people to show you who they are, and the way that you can do that is to ask investigative questions about people in a very open and honest and welcoming way, because if people feel like you are interrogating them, they will recluse. They won't be as open and share with you. And so I think that taking the time to ask questions, to take a genuine interest in people, is how you can actually not totally erase your unconscious bias, because we all will always have it, but you won't be leading with that in that sense.
It's part of why this is so hard. There's a great book by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's about how we have this system in our brain for forming snap judgments in situations that was useful in evolutionary terms. And then we have a slower system, which is more deliberative and rational. And the unconscious bias often operates on the kind of snap judgments that people make very quickly before they've even started thinking about a situation.
Exactly. And so I also will say this too. I brought this book out here because I think sometimes people are like, well, what do I do? And I came across this book. It's from Verna A. Myers, and it says, what if I say the wrong thing? 25 habits for culturally effective people. And in this book, she just talks about different scenarios that you encounter with people and how you can be aware of unconscious bias, how you can understand structural systems that put people behind. So I would really encourage getting this book here to really enter into the conversation correctly.
Okay, thank you, guys. I want to leave lots of time for questions. We've got 10 minutes for questions. I suspect that won't exhaust the questions we have in this room for this amazing panel. And if you want more, then we'll have a workshop together this afternoon where we can work through some of these things in a smaller setting. But if you could, so just some ground rules for the questions. If you could wait till you've got the microphone, hold the microphone. If it's one of these orange boxes, hold it quite close to your mouth so we can hear you. Keep the questions shortish, and we have a preference for questions over statements. So, hands up. All right, great.
Thank you. Is my mic on? Okay, so this is how we hold the box, all right, nice and close. So unconscious biases and conscious biases, right? It's, and the difficulties during times of political divisions. And so I wonder, with that kind of background, education, role of policymakers, and how can media play a positive role in carrying the better messages that can, bring about change, as opposed to, not opposed to, but how they may carry the negative news. And we've seen the Christchurch example, recently. The leaders over there and the community decided we're not going to mention his name, but we're going to stand together and not divide the community. Just a quick.
Caroline, do you want to take that one?
Yes. So I'm raising my kids myself. I have two sons, and I think there are like two parts. Like one is like what you can do at home, and the other one is what you can like do or expect from the school. And I think as citizens we have responsibility in both sides. No, like one, what we do at home. I'm raising boys. I'm surrounded by men at home. Then. So it's very important that they are like conscious, for example, about gender equality and all that. Everything referred to women issues. I think I hope that I'm doing a good job. But I also like talk to their schools and make sure that there is like a sense of diversity. I'm Latino. I'm a Latino woman in the United States with a very strong accent, and sometimes I just feel that there is a double responsibility on what I do as well, because it's not clear that I need certain resources, and I might like the community when I go to the schools in San Francisco where we used to live, or in New York. Sometimes we know that there are parents who you never see them at school because they really like go to work at the supermarket packing groceries, and they are like working from 7 to 7, and then the school sometimes is like not aware of those things. And I think we need to create spaces, and we need to ask them as parents to like create spaces so we can see each other, like we know who we are, we know the community, who the community is, and I think that's like something that we can ask, like the responsibility that we have to ask schools to be aware of that. And on the second responsibility as a professional, as a journalist, I think there is like a double agenda. We have this responsibility to create extraordinary content and be present, but also like to make sure that we are sustainable, because we basically represent a successful project in the United States created by people of color. And I think if like Radio Ambulante goes out of business by any, problem, that I don't think it will happen, it's something that will like close opportunities for other people like us. So yeah, probably that took me out of the education issue, but that's more about responsibility.
I just wanted to make a quick point. I think education is not the answer for this, because we have educated people who have class biases, who have gender biases, who have caste biases. And I think that just a quick thing to do would be to have some kind of affirmative action. I think that's really needed to fix the balance.
So you have affirmative action in India, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's written into the constitution,
yes.
And yet...
Yes. We have
so what's a good kind of affirmative action? That seems like it hasn't fixed the problem. I mean, maybe India would have more, kind of communal tension without that in the constitution, but it doesn't feel like it's sufficient. So what would be a fix that might work for that?
Just to respond to that, we have affirmative action, but we only have it in the government institutions. But the kind of privatization that has happened in India when it comes to education, workplace and all, it does not apply any longer. And I think that there is a conscious need to think about the kind of representation and have some kind of affirmative action also in this growing private sector.
I want to add on to that. Imagery is very important when we answer how the media can take responsibility. There is a difference between showcasing, say, a person of color in a negative light and that of a positive light, and that's a choice that media has. And there are implications with that. For example, there's a woman named Nia Wilson. She was on the BART in San Francisco, the Bay Area, and unfortunately, a white man came up to her and slit her throat, killed her. This woman was minding her business with her cousins, going home. And I won't say their name, but a news publication decided to post an image of her that was very unfavorable. Yet there was a full spectrum of images showing her in a positive light. And what happens is that when you show people of color specifically in a negative light, that's where those biases come in, those unconscious biases, and then you lose empathy. And so conversely, there is a rapper named Nipsey Hussle, who unfortunately was murdered in South Los Angeles. And I remember waiting, I'm like, oh my gosh, I wonder how the media is going to portray him, because I knew that he was such a wonderful person. And Yahoo News, actually the front page, it said, Nipsey Hussle, Grammy-nominated Nipsey Hussle. And I thought, wow, look at how that title, that image they put, totally shaped and spinned the way that the media portrayed him, that he has obviously been glorified for all the wonderful things he's done in his community. So that's the contrast that you see, is that the titles that we use, the imagery that we use, have positive and negative implications.
Do we have some more questions? Yes, please. Sorry, there's one over there. Alexandre, por favor.
Okay. A great panel. It's quite intriguing, some of the questions and some of the positions you took. But I always keep wondering, what is your attitude when you get the story wrong? Because this happens so many times in Brazil, and you can see this really big headline, whatever, and then some weeks later, this small note, oh, by the way, we had it wrong. So I was just wondering, what is your attitude yourselves? It's really one of those tricky questions.
I'll let you guys answer this as well, but speaking for myself, it's just, I mean, happily it hasn't happened too often, because The Economist has a research team who double checks everything that I write. So anything that's wrong has to get through them, and it's a point of professional pride on their part that they won't let things through. But it just feels horrible. I mean, it's the worst. It is absolutely the worst feeling, and it keeps. I remember when I started at The Economist, I used to wake up. The print edition comes out on a Friday morning. I used to wake up in a cold sweat on Friday mornings, worrying that one of the facts of the story might be wrong, and it was too late to do anything about it. And I still have a bit of that terror every time something is published. So I don't know, that's my own experience. How about you guys?
But I mean, I don't know what to say, because right now we are facing, in India, we're facing facing this problem a lot of fake news. And now the elections are on, and we are constantly dealing with it. And the kind of, like I said, there's a corporate political nexus, so some part of the media is also compromised. And they deliberately put out news which is not true. So at personal level, there are some news websites that have come up that they do regularly this kind of fact-checking. But I would say institutionally now, news organizations who have cut down on the desk, who do not have fact-checkers any longer. This is a problem, and we all are dealing with it, and we are actually facing ramifications of this kind of fake news. We have had riots engineered in India because of some fake news that was circulated, and 100 people died, 100,000 people lost their homes. So we're facing that a lot, and I don't think there's an institutional mechanism right now in India, with especially the media, to check it. And they're not making an effort also.
I will add to that I mean, it happened to us also, like, it was not a big thing, but it was just like a little mistake that came from the fact-checking. We have invested a lot on fact-checkers. I think what we do is that we want to be held accountable if we make mistakes. And this is important that press that we are like there, and we need to come and say, we heard this, we made a mistake, we face it, this is the right version or something. But I think there is something in journalism. I'm close to many of my colleagues and close friends are teachers of journalism, and I think it's important to remind the students that they need to go to the streets and they need to find the other side of the story. Many journalists now, they do calls or they browse the internet, but the reporting work is very important, and I think this is avoidable if we go and get one side of the story, but you try to contrast that with the other side, and that's avoidable then.
Guys, we are out of time. I know this has only whetted your appetite to hear more from these wonderful people, so please come along this afternoon when we be in a smaller group and we can work through some of this. But before that, just join me in thanking them.
Yeah, good job.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Fantastic, fantastic session.